Computer. Sweet. Whenever you're ready, John.
All right. Hello and welcome back to the Rossi Brothers Sports Podcast. My name is John, joined as always by my brother Adam. And today, Adam, who else is joining us?
Yeah, really excited today to be joined by a special guest, Mr. Tommy Tomlinson. Tommy Tomlinson is the author of the memoir The Elephant in the Room, about life as an overweight man in a growing America. He's working on a new book about the Westminster Dog Show. Tommy's the host of the podcast Southbound at WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news station, and he also does weekly commentaries for the station. He has written for publications including Esquire, ESPN the Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Forbes, Garden and Gun, and many others. He spent 23 years as a reporter and local columnist for the Charlotte Observer, where he was a finalist for the 2005 Pulitzer Prize in commentary. He has taught at colleges, workshops, and conferences across the country. He's a graduate of the University of Georgia and was a 2008-09 Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Tommy and his wife, Alex Felsing, live in Charlotte. Welcome so much, Tommy, and thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh, my pleasure, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So one thing we like to hear from all our guests is just a little bit about their individual sports stories and sports journeys, however long or short they may be. Just interested. Did you grow up playing sports at all?
I did. I was never much of an athlete, but I did play a lot of sports. In organized sports, I think about as far as I got was, I played Little League Baseball, which actually where I grew up in South Georgia, they didn't even have like official Little League. They had, and I hate to call it this, but they called it Midget League Baseball. And so that was like from like 8, 9, 10, I played in that as a pretty bad outfielder and occasional first baseman. And then, the sport I played the most and loved the most was basketball. And I played pretty regularly in rec leagues and church leagues and stuff like that. And then, it was a pretty regular, like the Y and the local, playgrounds and stuff. Into my 20s, I played quite a bit of basketball. And so that was my big sport. But, I played tennis, football, softball, ping pong. My one great athletic story, when I was at the University of Georgia, I played a lot of ping pong. And a buddy of mine and I made the semifinals of the campus ping pong tournament.
Okay.
And and we got to the semifinals, and our opponents walked in, and one of the guys was carrying a little small gym bag, and he opened it up, and he had ping pong shoes, which before that moment I did not know even existed. And I looked at my buddy and said, "Yeah," I said, "We're dead," and we were. He had played in like the U.S. Open that year or something, and he and his partner crushed us. But we made the semis, so I was happy about that.
I say that's still quite an accomplishment. Yeah.
Ping pong shoes. Was he someone who would stand like 20 feet behind the table?
Yeah, he didn't have to for us because we couldn't hit it that far. But he hit shots that like I could barely see, much less return. And so it was just it was a mismatch and his partner was not as good, but he was better. His partner was better than us too. So we got wiped out pretty quick.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's quite the story though. Have you seen ping pong shoes since then?
Well, I watch now, on YouTube clips and stuff, and all these guys have like their fancy shoes and their obviously special paddles and all that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a whole world out there of ping pong outfits that I didn't know existed before that moment.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay.
That's all you, John.
I was gonna say, it never ceases to amaze me, like the level of depth there is to so many things. And like something that on the surface is like, oh, it's just ping pong, and then you can be like, oh, there's a lot of expertise to be had to this. So.
Well, and YouTube and that sort of thing can really, like, you can go really down the rabbit hole on like different kinds of serves and all that. I have not done that, but for anything, any pursuit now, there's like you can learn so much about it so easily. It's pretty amazing.
The knowledge economy. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot out there.
Yeah.
I understand you were part of the debate team in high school. Um,
That was my main thing. Yeah.
okay. Now is that a sport?
Well, you believe it or not, we got varsity letters for it.
Okay.
I
There you
was
go.
never, I never had the courage to actually like put it on a letter jacket or anything, but somewhere in a box, in the house somewhere, I have my debate letter, which was pretty dubious, I guess. But it's not a sport. No, I think of the sport as like, something has to be like a physical thing, like where you couldn't just like tell somebody else to do it and they had to do something physical to do it. Like chess is not a sport because you can just tell somebody to make the moves for you. But bowling is a sport because even though you drink beer during it, you still have to actually bowl the ball down the lane. No, debate is not anywhere near a sport. But I did learn a lot doing it and have a lot of fun doing it. And it was a probably very useful thing in my career as it turned out.
Okay. So
Does
the
that like hone your mind to think faster? Because in my mind, I think of debate as like speaking quickly, but also I don't know if the thought pattern also like matches that.
Yeah, I was never the fastest speaker, but I think what it did do was require you to process information quickly. So as the other side is making their argument or whatever, you have to figure.
little unstable connection, perhaps.
Place and have to process a lot of information pretty quickly. And then a big part of my job is interviews and conversations where I'm listening to somebody thinking about what they're talking about and then trying to think about what I want to say or ask them based on that. And so, yeah, I think it has been pretty useful to me in sort of as a sort of a career thing.
It sounds like based on your definition, which I'm really excited that you gave that definition because I didn't even ask for that. But okay, now it's making me think about this definition of sports, which I haven't really thought a whole lot of since high school. Because honestly, like middle school and high school, the big thing that I remember is cheerleading a sport or not? We didn't have a dance team. A lot of other like things like that other schools maybe had that we didn't. John and I both went to a pretty small school. We had cheerleaders. So a lot of the cheerleaders were into like, this is a sport. And a lot of the people like maybe me were like, no, it's not a sport. It's no. And we'd probably come up with definitions of what's a sport and what makes it or not. But it sounds like from your definition that you would call cheerleading a sport because it takes some physical something to do it.
I mean, cheerleading is basically team gymnastics, right? And so I think if you base it on if you judge, I don't know how they judge a cheerleading competition, but if you judge it on, the quality of their flips and whether they fall or not and all that sort of thing, sure, that could be a sport.
I'm sorry, any cheerleaders I may have argued against in my middle school or high school years. I stand corrected. I agree with you.
I like the Big Ten. I like to, I lit in lots of things. Cornhole, sure, that's a sport.
How about NASCAR? Something I know you wrote an article about.
Absolutely, NASCAR is a sport, and I'll tell you why. Because the skill, not just like mental or whatever, but the physical skill that it requires to drive a car really fast, and the sort of courage it takes to do that. You can't just throw a random person in a car and they can do what Richard Petty did.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you an example of that. So I did a big story for ESPN on Dale Earnhardt Jr. a few years ago as he was coming back from a bunch of concussions. By the way, if you get a lot of concussions in your event, it's probably a sport, right? And he was telling me about the last race of the year they have, which is used to be and maybe still is down at Homestead Speedway outside of Miami. And it was in November. And the race was in the late afternoon. And at some point during the day, the sun would set over the edge of the track, and it would get right to the point where it was like right at the lip of the stadium. And what that meant was, for about 20 minutes, every race there, you would come around the turn and you couldn't see. And so these guys are going 180 miles an hour. There's at the most, if there are no wrecks, 40 something cars on the track. And you're driving blind for several seconds per lap for about 20 minutes.
So there aren't. I imagine race cars don't have the little like flip down. Like
they don't have the little. They don't have the little shades. Wouldn't do you much good anyway. And I said, well, what's that like? And he said, well, have you ever flown through a cloud in a plane? That's what it's like. You just can't see anything for a little bit. And I said, how do you even do that? And he said, well, I have experience. I have a good control of my car. We have spotters who are watching us in case anything goes wrong. And I trust my fellow drivers, and to me, something where you're going 180 miles an hour, you're blind and there's 40 people around you doing the same thing and you're having to like control that car. Yeah, that's a sport. There's there's certainly lots of ranges of physical ability in that sport. But for one thing, endurance is, if you're driving 500 miles at that speed, you have to have some sort of physical endurance. It's not just a sport.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who's driven fast on the interstate and you jump into a NASCAR level vehicle, it's an entirely different world.
Well said. Well said. I have a newfound appreciation for NASCAR.
Good.
Amen. Maybe we can just, we've already dug into a little bit of your sports writing career, but how did you sort of get started, doing this, right? Being a sports writer, kind of pursuing that as a career?
Yeah, well, I've actually had a pretty wide-ranging career. I've done lots of different stuff, and sports has been kind of a big part of it, but only a part of it. I think where I started doing sports pretty regularly was when I worked at the Charlotte Observer newspaper. I was the local columnist there, and I wrote a news column, and so it would be about the local news of the day or big stories coming through our area or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. But part of that job for me ended up becoming, if there were big sports events that involved like Carolina's teams or something happening in Charlotte, I would often go write like a column off of it, not necessarily like the game piece, but sort of a feature, or what we used to call a color piece. And so there were lots of those things. So a lot of them involved basketball. So this, North Carolina, huge college basketball state. UNC and Duke obviously are both good basically every year. Both of them, when I was writing a column, went to multiple Final Fours, and I went to many of those Final Fours to watch those teams and to write about those teams. Also, the NBA All-Star Game came to Charlotte when I was a local columnist. Charlotte got an NFL team, the Panthers. I went to their first game and wrote about that. And then a few years later, they went to a Super Bowl, and I wrote about that. And so I had this sort of kind of semi-regular sports writing was part of my regular job as a news columnist. And then in 2011, I'd sort of branched out. My first big magazine story was for Sports Illustrated. And I wrote a story about the guy at the big Alabama fan who poisoned the trees on the campus at Auburn at what's called Toomer's Corner. Toomer's Corner is like the most famous gathering spot in Auburn. There's these two giant oak trees that sort of mark the entrance to the campus. One year, Auburn beat Alabama. That was the year Cam Newton was the starter quarterback at Auburn. This one disillusioned Alabama fan named Harvey Updike drove to the Auburn campus that night and poured poison around the trees, and then admitted it a few weeks later on the Paul Feinbaum radio show. And that became a huge, huge story back then. And so I went down to Auburn and did a big story about it. That became my first magazine piece that ran in SI back in 2011. And then I kind of leveraged that into a semi-regular sports writing career after that.
I remember that going on. And I had a chance to read in depth and skim a lot of other your articles, but didn't read that one. I am going to put that on my list. I want to read that now. Yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, it was a crazy time. And I got to, the guy, Harvey Updike, was kind of hard to find at the time, but I tracked him down and talked to him and talked to his son. He named his son after Bear Bryant, the Alabama coach.
Yeah.
And it was a really crazy time and a sad time too, because people at Auburn really loved those trees, and they were just a symbol for a lot of memories there. And they had to cut them down. His poison worked, and they had to cut down the trees.
Gee, do you know if they replanted them?
They did. They replanted other trees there, and people still go down to Toomer's Corner when Auburn has a big victory or something. But the original trees are not there anymore.
You
Is that good?
So I'm just curious about you. You kind of talked to a little bit there, but if you were to talk about your process and your writing process, like I guess one thing I thought was like, oh, did you have that idea and say, hey, Charlotte Observer, I should go write this story? Or are they like, hey, go down to Toomer's Corner and write this piece? But yeah, just talk about that and your writing process.
Well, that particular story, I kind of did on spec in a way. So the Observer that wasn't a story I would do for the Observer. It's sort of out of their coverage range and that sort of thing. But I wanted to write it for Sports Illustrated. And you guys had mentioned before we actually came on the air, talked about Joe Posnanski, who's a longtime friend of mine. Joe was working for SI at the time, and I mentioned this story to him, and he said that I should pitch it to the magazine. And I did. I talked to the guy, Chris Stone, who was editor of the magazine at the time. And, I was an unknown to him. I didn't have many clips or any of that sort of thing to show him. And I think he liked the idea, but he was sort of waffling about whether to assign me to do it or not. And so I took a little vacation time from the Observer, and I just went to Auburn for the weekend. It's about a 6-hour drive from Charlotte. And so I just spent the weekend down there, talked to people, hung out at the trees, met some people there, met a couple of people who knew a lot about him, historians and that sort of thing. And on the drive back, I called Chris back at SI and said, well, here's what I've learned. What do you think? And that was convincing. He assigned me to do the story then. And so I kind of done the work, not knowing if I was going to actually get to write the story at all, which is one of the few times I've done that. But my process in general is, I'm a voracious reader. So I'm reading, back in the newspaper and magazine days, a lot of the big local and regional papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, then big magazines, ESPN magazine when it was around, and SI and lots of other things. And then, of course, as the internet became more prominent, a lot of blogs and a lot of websites and Twitter and all these different things, to just voraciously like hoovering up as much information as I can and thinking about things that sort of particularly interest me. I would say over the years, and not all my stories fall into this category, but a lot of them do. I like to do stories on people who are kind of out of the spotlight a little bit, either because they used to be in the spotlight and now they've sort of receded, or they never quite got there for whatever reason. Or maybe a big story that there's a aspect of it that people don't know that much about. I think that Toomer's Corner story probably has some of that in it. And I like exploring those stories that aren't quite like the news of the day. Like there are a lot of really good writers and reporters who write about the big stars, who write about, Tom Brady and LeBron and, Mike Trout and whoever. And I'm not in the competition to write about those people. So I try to find other avenues, other interesting things to write about. And so when I get a hold of a story that's interesting to me, I start poking around on it, doing some reporting, kind of doing a lot of reading on it. And, that's a sorting process. Sometimes I do that stuff and I decide, I don't want to do that. But then if I have enough, and sort of the threshold for me is if I keep thinking about it, if I'm like having supper and it's sort of itching at my brain, or when I go to bed at night, if that story is still kind of banging around in there, then that's the kind of stories that I will then try to figure out if I can find a place to do them and publish them somewhere.
Super cool.
I
It sounds.
Mhm.
Oh, you, John.
Okay, I was gonna say I just think like reading, especially a lot of like quotations that you have, and it sounds like part of some of the earlier process too is like talking to people, doing some like discovery about these sort of like articles. I don't, just in my mind, like I feel like that's something that can often go unnoticed by someone just reading an article, like how much, consulting with people who know things about what you're writing about, and like you're saying, sort of similar to what you're saying, you like to read a lot, that kind of reading aspect of like information gathering, but with specific people, how much of that also like goes into this?
Sure. I mean, there's a ton, and most of it never gets into the story because you have to constantly sort of whittle down and boil the story down to its essence. And that means a lot of stuff gets left out, and a lot of people who provided interesting information or context or shading to a story don't make it into the story by name, but I'm always grateful to talk to them and always thank them after the story is out. I'll give you a quick example. So back in 2014, I did a story about Dean Smith, the famous basketball coach in North Carolina. So Dean Smith, by that time, had retired and he had developed dementia, and it was sort of an open secret among the North Carolina crowd, but nobody had really written about it in a big way yet. And I wanted to write about it, and it turned out that kind of the gatekeeper for that story was Dean's wife, Linnea. She was very private. She wanted to keep that information as private as possible. So she and Dean's family had sort of decided they weren't going to talk about it. And I approached her to talk about it at some point and sort of got rebuffed a little bit at first and kind of kept after it. And in the meantime, I interviewed a bunch of people sort of in their circle. And that was like former players, former coaches, like assistants of his, people who knew them around Chapel Hill, people who had gone to his church. I think a physical therapist that they had. I talked to him at some point, like probably 20 or 30 people that I talked to without even knowing really if I was going to get to do the story. And getting to do the story meant to me sort of breaking through to that inner circle. And this was over a period of about 6 months. At the time, I was working on a contract for ESPN the Magazine, and I had the great luxury that most freelancers don't have. I was getting paid either way. So they were paying me to sort of do the speculation work on this story. And so it took 6 months from the time I first started asking around about that story to the time that Dean's wife agreed to talk to me. And in that time, all those other people had said, look, I'll talk to you, but you can't be on the record unless Dean's wife says it's okay. And so when she said yes, I went back to all those other people, and that sort of all the dominoes fell. And so then I was able to do the story after that fairly quickly because everybody was willing to talk to me then. But it took a long, hard road of digging and sort of, a long period of not knowing whether I was going to get to write the story at all before I got to do it. And most of the people who I talked to during that period, their names did not appear in the story, but they were a huge help in helping me figure out who else to talk to and helping give me context on Dean's life. And so those, I always make a list of everybody I've talked to in a story. And when the story comes out, I send them all thank you notes because they all contributed in big ways and small to the story being out.
When you are interviewing someone, do you typically record them, like their voice? Is that kind of your go-to?
Yeah, I mean, these days, especially when I do longer interviews, like sometimes I'll sit down with somebody and it might be 2 or 3 hours. That's just more note taking than my hands and brain can handle, you know.
Right.
So I do
Yeah.
record. I used to have the little pocket recorders that they have around now. The recorders on phones are so good that I just use those. But I still carry a notebook and I still use a notebook when I'm doing these interviews. And what I'm doing is I'm taking sort of what I call environmental notes. So as I'm talking to the person, the phone is recording our voices, but the phone can't
Mm.
see what I can see. And so I'm writing down like what the room looks like and what the weather's like and the expression on the other person's face, whether I felt like on some answer they were maybe not telling me the truth, or maybe something I said really hit home with them, or whatever it is, all these little details that I think I might be able to use later on. And so I still, even though I'm recording the interview, I'm still taking notes pretty frequently as I'm doing the interview.
And might I say, the good writer that you are, and good writers that I have read, that you saying that makes a lot of sense because that makes it into the story. You set the scene, you talk about, this tree or that whatever, like you said, the expression on someone's face, but that makes a lot of sense that you take notes on that.
Yeah, all that sort of sensory information, like what music is playing in the background or what a place smelled like or any of that sort of thing, that's all potentially useful or maybe even important later on. I mean, sometimes I'll take a note on something and I won't even know till later that it's meaningful. And so I'm getting all that stuff down in case it becomes useful or important later on.
Yeah. Also seems too like, I don't know, you must be like, have really grown as just sort of, I don't know if a character like study maybe is the right word, or like the ability to read other people and just be able to, I don't know, relate or interpret on a certain level. If you do a lot of interviewing and a lot of, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it varies a lot on who you talk to and when and how you talk to them. That
Mhm.
Dale Earnhardt Jr. story I was mentioning before. Dale is a great guy, but notoriously he can have bad moods. And like there was one time that I talked to him, I probably talked to him a dozen times for that story. And there was one time we went out to take pictures at his house. I don't think he likes strangers at his house. And he was really kind of in a bad mood that day. And a bad mood doesn't mean he was like yelling at us or anything, but he was just like pouting a little bit and he was not playing ball at all with us. He was doing what we asked him to do and nothing more. And so that's part of the deal is that sometimes you're going to catch people in a bad mood. That's why it's important to talk to people more than once, if at all possible. And it's also why it's important to try to get people where they're comfortable. Like Dale Jr. wasn't as comfortable with strangers in his house, but he was comfortable like on the road because he spent so much time on the road as a NASCAR driver. So we talked like they all have these buses like rock stars that they go from place to place in and where they stay when they're there for a race. So in his bus he was great. He was easy to talk to when he was like in the press box and a couple of other places. He was really easy to talk to. So you kind of figure out where somebody's comfortable, where they're likely to open up, where they and after a while they have to get comfortable with you. And I always tell people any interview, no matter how long it is, the first third of it, if it's a new person you're talking to, is probably not going to be much good because that person is deciding whether to trust you, how much they want to tell you, whether they think you will looking to do them harm in some way, all that sort of thing. So a big part of the beginning of an interview for me is just to kind of set out, I kind of lay the ground rules really. Here's how I do things. Here's my process. Here's why I want to know stuff. If you have any questions you want to ask me, please feel free to do it. Here's why I want to sit down with you, and why I want to do it face to face and all those sorts of things. And so that part of the interview is just kind of a feeling out process. And then later on is generally when I tend to get the better material.
That makes a lot of sense. Building that rapport with someone. And I would imagine, I mean, just having spoken however long we've spoken now, like I can tell you're a really good interviewer, and you make people feel very comfortable, which I appreciate. But I would guess, correct me if I'm wrong, there have been people that you've reached out to, or even maybe accept an interview with, it just for whatever reason didn't work out, and you ended up doing a story or whatever. And maybe could you talk a little bit about like what's that like? Like how do you respond to that?
Well, again, when I was at ESPN, and again, I had the luxury of time to spend on this story. I tried to do a story on Tim Tebow. And this was after he had played for the Steelers, I guess, and won a big playoff game with them as a quarterback. But also, it was very apparent he didn't really have the skills to be an NFL quarterback. But he had a huge number of fans, both from his college playing days and sort of from his evangelical Christian worldview, who were really rooting for him and really still believed he was kind of NFL quality. And so whatever year that was, I don't remember now, maybe 2015 or 2016, he signed with the Eagles and went to training camp with them. And I went to training camp to try to get a story on him and try to understand, the idea. I don't always come in with like a big idea on a story. Sometimes the idea comes from talking to a person. Sometimes I have an idea and it changes once I talk to a person or whatever. But the idea I had for Tim Tebow was this. A big part of the particular Christian theology that he followed and that people around him followed is sort of called the prosperity gospel. The idea that if you are a believer, that what you want will come to you. You'll basically get the riches, the wealth, the material things, whatever it is.
God will bless you with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he was at a point in his career when he was not prospering and still thought he should. And I was trying to get the idea, like, what does that do to somebody when their faith and the reality that they're dealing with come into conflict? Well, he wasn't having it, basically. I mean, he was, the few times I talked to him, he was perfectly polite. He was a nice guy. I came away liking him, but he just did not want to bite on those kinds of subjects, and really wouldn't bite on much of anything that I was offering. For whatever reason, we didn't hit it off great. I mean, I wasn't mean to him. He wasn't mean to me. It was just like a first date that just didn't work out or whatever. And I was talking to his teammates and to his sort of representatives, his entourage and all that, people trying to get some of the same stuff. And I wouldn't get anywhere with them either. And after, I don't know, I was at the training camp for probably a week. And then for another few weeks after that, after I went back home, I kept trying, through other various ways to get something. I talked to my editors and I said, look, I don't think I'm going to get this story. And they said, okay. And so we just abandoned it. And so for every, story you see that you really like in any writer's life, there's probably multiple stories that they tried to get and couldn't for whatever reason. Either the subject didn't want to cooperate, or the timing wasn't right, or somebody else got there first, or whatever it is. And so, it's always that sort of tip of the iceberg metaphor is accurate. For everything you see, there's a lot you don't see. And that's true not only in, putting together stories we talked about before, but in actually the stories that we pursue and the ideas that we pursue. There's lots of great ideas I've had, I think, that for whatever reason just have never gotten done.
I'm fascinated now just hearing you talk about like, oh, you went and talked to Tim Tebow. Like, if I were to go to Eagles training camp and want to talk to Tim Tebow, like, I wouldn't know where to start. And I remember, just reading some stuff about other sports writers and talking to these people. I'm like, how do they do that? Like, how do, like, say you want to talk to people, how do you go about that?
Well, I mean, it helps certainly to have ESPN on your name tag, right? I mean, that brings an authority to it that sort of automatically they know you're legit, as opposed to just like some guy off the truck, right? And which I think is hard these days, by the way, for a lot of independent sports writers, people who have their own, excuse me, their own blogs, their own Substacks, and they're trying to get access. And, they don't, the coach of North Carolina is not going to talk to some guy they've never heard of before. It just has, 45 people following them on their blog or whatever. It's a different level of access. But once you get in, I think it's a question of, first of all, I think a big part of it is trying to tell the person involved who you are and why you want to talk to them, and to try to get across that you're not there to waste their time. Professional athletes are, and even, prominent college athletes are extremely busy people. They have a lot of demands on their time and lots of things pulling at them. And, Tim Tebow, for example, when I would go up to interview him, there'd be like 6 other people there too. And in locker room situations, it could be many more than that. So you want to try to get there, tell them you're not wasting their time, be, quick and efficient and explain why you're there and what you're doing. And then try to be engaging in a way that makes the other person want to talk to you. You don't want to like mumble. You don't want to like yell your question. You don't want to be hyper aggressive or any of that sort of thing. You want to come across as I'm a person that you would enjoy having a conversation with. So let's have a conversation. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, if somebody's in a bad mood that day or they're need to be somewhere else, you're just not going to get it, at least not then. Sometimes it helps to get people away from those sort of gaggle situations. Like if I can get somebody at, like, if they're doing a charity event, or if they're doing something away from practice or the game or whatever, I can get them on the golf course or whatever. In those situations, for many athletes, they're more comfortable, they're more relaxed. They don't feel like people are looking over their shoulder, and they could take more time. And also, it says to them that you're willing to go sort of above and beyond to get to them, to talk to them. And so I found in those situations, that kind of work can be helpful as well.
Wow. I'm loving this. This is so fascinating to me.
Oh, thanks.
I'm curious, just around where you talk about your 4 questions about when sort of asking yourself what to write about, advice of just sort of, I guess, for writers. Is that something that you kind of developed throughout your career? Is it something that you sort of knew when you started writing, or how does that, because I guess the other thing to me is that hearing you talk about, these interviews, and even like the angle you're saying of like how you wanted to interview Tim Tebow about, like, there's an aspect of, you that comes across in this as well. That's like things that you're interested in, things that it seems like readers would be interested in too. That sort of seemed to be in some way a theme of your advice on like what to choose to write about as a writer. So I'm curious if that's something that you kind of grew to understand over time, or you knew kind of going in.
Well, I mean, I certainly didn't know it in terms of being able to write it down. I mean, I think I learned it gradually over the years and with lots of experience and lots and lots and lots of mistakes and bad stories, lots of failures, I guess, as I would say. But over time, I have I'm at the point in my career now where I've done this for a while, and by and large, I get to kind of choose the stories I really want to do. And so when you get to that point, I've spent many, many years not choosing, again, doing kind of whatever was handed to me or whatever I got assigned or whatever. And a big turning point in any writer's career, pretty much anybody's career, is when you get to stop doing what everybody else wants you to do, and you get to start doing what you want to do.
Mhm.
And as I thought about that, and thought about the kind of stories that I want to do, and how to put a structure on it, I think this 4 questions thing that you mentioned came from, I was trying to teach a class and to approach, like, how do you decide what you want to write about? And I started thinking in a reflective way, like, how do I decide? Because I'd not really put a structure on that before. And so I came up with these 4 questions, which are, what do you feel you know about? Like, what's your expertise? What are things that you care about? Like, what's really things that motivate you, get you excited? What are you curious about? What are things you really want to know more about? And then what scares you? What are the things that, you fear? And if you start writing down lists to answer each of those 4 questions, and especially if you look at topics that maybe you write down more than once on those lists, that's sort of your sweet spot. Those are sort of the areas where that's where your mind is and your heart. And those are the things that you keep coming back to and keep thinking about. And so if you can sort of figure out not just story ideas that fit in those frames, but once you have a story idea, how those ideas fit in those frames as well. And so I do think about that still all the time. And I think about that in terms of interviewing people too. Like, I ask people variations on those questions in interviews, and I find that it's kind of really enlightening to figure out what they know about, what they care about, what they're curious about, what they're scared of. And those things are pretty good questions to help kind of figure out who you are.
Yeah. I'm not really like an aspiring writer in any way, but that as I reading that, I was like, oh, I really like that. That kind of struck me, and I was like,
Yeah,
even in any, even more broadly in life, I feel like that's a good
exactly.
practice.
I think you don't have to be a writer for those questions to be useful for you.
You mentioned, being able to kind of decide what you write, and I imagine your book, The Elephant in the Room, was something that you decided to write about. Did those 4 questions at all play into your decision making to write that book?
Yes, very much so, and especially that last one. What scares you? So I had known for ever since I became a writer that I had this story to tell about being an overweight person in the world, and what it's like, and maybe what people don't understand about it, and how difficult it is to try to lose weight or overcome any kind of addictive behavior. But man, I did not want to write that story. I was so afraid of it. And every time I started to think about it, I just like pushed it away. So in 2014, I was watching SportsCenter one night. And at the end of SportsCenter, I'm sure you guys know, they often have a little like funny highlight at the end of the show where they play some like silly thing that happened in sports that day. And the night I was watching, they played a highlight from like a minor league arena football game in Lexington, Kentucky. And it was on what I found out later was like a rug they had put over the dirt floor of like a horseshoe arena.
Wow.
And the reason they did it, the reason they showed this highlight was there was a guy playing quarterback for one of the teams named Jared Lorenzen. Jared had been an all-SEC quarterback at Kentucky in the early 2000s.
Hefty lefty.
The hefty lefty. He was known for being the biggest quarterback anybody had ever seen. He played at around 300 pounds when he was at Kentucky, which back then was the size of most offensive linemen. He actually made it in the NFL. He had a Super Bowl ring because he backed up Eli Manning one year that the Giants won the Super Bowl. But he had washed out of the NFL at that point. And at the time I saw that clip, he was playing quarterback for this minor league indoor football team. He had gained even more weight. He was probably around 400 pounds. But he was still awesome. I mean, he was still slinging it, throwing darts. He was amazing. And that's why the commentators were sort of part amazed and part laughing that this guy was so big could be so good. And I thought two things when I saw that video. I thought somebody ought to write about that guy, and that I could understand him in a way that maybe other people couldn't. Because I too was a fat guy. Jared and I were around the same size. So a couple of days later, I think I don't remember if I talked to the editor first or I looked him up first. I think I talked to my editor first and said, here's a little story idea. I want to see if this guy has any interest in talking to me. My editor said, sure, go ahead, pursue it. And I emailed him and basically said, Jared, you don't know me from Adam, but I'm a fat guy like you. I write for ESPN. I would love to come and tell your story. And to his everlasting credit, he said yes. And so I went up. He was living just outside Cincinnati at that time. Spent tons of time with him, hung out with him, played wiffle ball with him, went to his work, met his estranged wife. They had gotten a divorce because she was tired of arguing with him about losing weight. Talked to his family, former coaches, all these people. And I ended up writing the story about Jared and his battle to lose weight and how it had defined his life, his entire life, from the time he was 8 years old and his like little league football coach saw him throw the ball a mile and thought that guy would be a great quarterback, but he's so big, I don't know if we can do it. Jared was incredibly open with me, incredibly honest about everything. And as I talked to him, I heard so many parallels with my life. And as I was writing that story, I thought to myself, well, you know what? If he's courageous enough, if he's got the guts enough to do it, then I should. I'd actually talked to my book agent about that, doing a memoir like that years before, like 3 years before. And my agent said, that's a great idea. You ought to do it. But I was scared. Only after talking to Jared and starting to do that story did I muster up the courage. I emailed my agent and I said, I'm finally ready to do this book. I finished Jared's story, and not long after that, got a contract for the book and wrote the book, The Elephant in the Room.
Wow. That's super inspiring.
Well, thanks. And it's you know, the other thing about that story I think about a lot is, you know, at the time, some of the editors at ESPN were wondering why I was doing that story, because Jared was not a star, right? He wasn't somebody they were ever going to put on the cover of the magazine. He wasn't even well known to a ton of people, even in the college football world, you know. For people who were like diehard fans, they all knew who he was, but not everybody knew who he was. But the subject matter was something that everybody could relate to, whether they're overweight or not. Everybody has something. And that story ended up becoming like the most viewed feature story on ESPN's website that whole year, I think. It really exploded. I got thousands of letters and emails from all over the world, literally, from that story. And I think it's a good reminder to me that you don't have to write about the stars. You know, if you write the right way about, you know, ordinary people, that can gain a following too.
Yeah. I don't know, that strikes me too, what you just said about like everybody has something, where like,
Oh yeah.
I think, you know, I that definitely resonates. Like, I think it's just such a pervasive thing, just like general self-image, even if not necessarily like body image issue, just more broadly. And like, I think there are a lot of positive steps happening towards talking about it more.
Yeah.
I don't know if if you have particular insight into that.
Well, I mean, it helped me talk about it more. Certainly, you know, that book came out almost 4 years ago now, and I'm still talking about it. People still interview me about it. People still email me. You know, they find it, they pick it up at the bookstore, the library, or somewhere. You know, the book is new. One of the great things about a book is it's got legs. People will find that book anew for years and years and years. And so they'll come to me and talk about it for years and years and years. And so it's helped me really open up about this stuff and talk about it more. I did an episode of the SEC Network, has a show called True South, where they talk about southern towns and talk about the food and culture in there. And they recently did an episode on my hometown, and I was sort of the guest star, I guess. And we talked a lot about the book and my weight and all that sort of thing, and it all kind of, when that came out last weekend, I heard from a bunch of other people who wanted to talk about this stuff. And so for the rest of my life, I'll be talking about those things. And to your point, one of the best letters I got and have gotten in this whole time, a guy sent me a handwritten letter from Austria. I don't even know how the heck he found my book in Austria, but he did. And he sent me a handwritten letter. It was like a 10-page letter. And what I loved about it was he didn't have a weight problem. His problem wasn't his anxiety, but he saw so many parallels in how he dealt with his issues and how I deal with my issues that the book was meaningful to him. And so I think that's, I think if people talk about these things, I think they'll find that not only do a lot of people share that specific issue that they might have, but a lot of people share larger issues where there's a lot of overlap. And so a lot of people can benefit from hearing about it and can help you learn more about it yourself.
Wow, really poignant. I'm thinking right now about, I'm not sure if you've heard it, but I'm really into this song. It's not really like people who know me is like, wait, you like this song? It's like very like poppy and like gets a lot of airplay right now, but there's a song out called Victoria's Secret by the singer Jax. I recommend listening to it if you haven't heard it yet. I'm all about it.
It's a great title.
Yeah, it's this pop song, and you might say on the surface, well, this is about somebody very different. This is about somebody very thin. But I see a huge parallel because it's another story about body image, right? Maybe on the opposite side of the spectrum, but it's still telling a story of someone really struggling with how they see their own body. And to me, that's something I definitely can relate to. And I would guess a lot of people can. And I'd be curious just to know, like, what advice would you have for people who do struggle with any type of body image, just accepting their own body?
Well, I mean, the first couple of things, the simple things, are what they talk about in AA and places like that. It's one day at a time. It really is. It's if you have a bad day, you can't give up on yourself for that. The next day is a clean slate, a chance to start over. And the other thing that they say a lot in AA meetings, places like that, is easy does it. Don't crush yourself for making a mistake. Don't, abuse yourself for falling short in any way. Just be kind to yourself. I know so many people, and I probably have been among them in the past, who are really kind to everybody else in their lives except themselves, right? They're like super hard on themselves and super easy on everybody else. Well, that's kind of dumb, right? Why, if you're going to be really nice to everybody else, why not reflect some of that upon yourself as well? So those are a couple of things. And then I think, there are lots of the other sort of general advice I would give is not to look for like the quick fix. There are in my world, in the overweight person's world, there's always some new diet. There's always some new fad that, right now it's like keto and fasting and, all that sort of thing, that if you have 10 pounds to lose, you could probably do that stuff and you can lose 10 pounds pretty quick. You feel much better about yourself. Fantastic. If you have 200 pounds to lose, those things are never going to work in the long term. They're not sustainable. And so you have to think about solutions that you can live with and what they're going to be inevitably, even though this is boring and frustrating and all that, it's small ball solutions. You eat a little bit less every day. You reduce your calories by a little bit. And if you're, on the other side of it, you increase by a little bit every day. You don't beat anorexia by binging. You beat it by having like one extra, piece of bread every day or something until your body can handle that and you go to the next thing. And so these are solutions that, people know about and people understand, just inherently, but they're not that quick fix that everybody's looking for. And so people ignore them. They're looking for something that's going to be, I'm going to have a new body in 2 weeks. And you might have that new body, but then like 2 months from now, you're going to have the same old body again. And you're going to feel worse about yourself than you did when you started. And so, one day at a time, small ball solutions, no matter what your addiction, compulsion, obsession, whatever it is, those are the ways to solve them. And they always have been. We just hate hearing that advice, but it's the advice that works.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's like most things are like sold in the other way, in the like, this will help you in like 1 month sort of way.
Yeah. If you look at like the Amazon top 100
like
books,
quick,
10 of them are going to be diet books, and they're all going to be diets that will work in the short term, but not in the long term.
Yeah. As you say, also on your first piece of advice too, as someone who tends to be hard on myself, and not as much on others, that also very much resonates. But as I don't know if you had another question there, Adam. I was gonna say I could talk about this longer. I think also we don't want to take too much more of your time. I want to touch quickly just on you host the Southbound podcast we mentioned. What kind of inspired that podcast, and sort of talking about right, like you mentioned being on the SEC Network show just recently. It seems like being from the South, having that sort of identity with the South is another thing that's important to you. Yeah. So what just kind of inspired the podcast and your work on that?
Sure. So, along the way, as podcasts, this is like 2013, 2012, or whatever, as podcasts became obviously something that was going to be around to stay. I started thinking about, is there something I could do? Is there something I would be interested in? Is there a topic or whatever in mind that I could do well as a podcast? And along that time is when I was really doing a lot of long magazine stories. And part of the deal when you're doing these long magazine stories, you do these long interviews and you get transcripts. And so I was reading these transcripts of these interviews. Sometimes they were really great conversations. And I found myself wishing sometimes we ought to just publish the transcript of the interview, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of what a podcast is, or at least a version of it is. It's a Q&A. It's a conversation that people get to listen in on. And so, so I started trying to figure out how to just kind of do it on my own. At some point, I met the WFAE, which is the NPR station here in Charlotte. A new person came in to run that station. We had coffee together, and I started talking about this idea I had. And the idea was to do this sort of, interview style podcast, but for it to be about interesting Southerners. So there's a famous NPR show called Fresh Air. This woman, Terry Gross, who's been doing it forever, and it's great. She's brilliant at doing it. And the way I pitched it was, it's sort of fresh air with a Southern accent. Mm-hmm. It's interesting Southerners from all walks of life and how the South sort of shapes them. And so that's the idea I pitched, and that's the show that they ended up, luckily for me, allowing me to do. And we just finished our 5th year last month. And so I'm really grateful to get to do that. And the South means a lot to me. It's a very conflicted, very contradictory place, with many, many flaws and many, many things I love about it. And, this Patterson Hood, who's the lead singer of this band called the Drive-By Truckers, likes to talk about the duality of the Southern thing. And I think more than anything else, what I've tried to explore in the podcast is that duality, is that there's so many of us who love the South despite all its flaws. And how do we, square that circle?
Gotcha, man. Wow. Yeah, that's again, there's a whole other depth of things that we could probably get into discussing there too.
Yeah.
Well, that's the bad thing
which
about
is-
every podcast. Sometimes it always has to end.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously, I mean, congratulations. They're 5 years worth of podcasts on this topic with you talking about it to listen to. So people can check that out if they're curious to actually delve into this. Yeah, so we just want to finish off with one sort of final question that we like to ask all of our guests just to sort of wrap up. So just Tommy, very broadly to you, why are sports important?
Sports matter because they give us an outlet for all the feelings that we have to tamp down in our normal lives. In your normal life, you don't get to scream and jump up and down and run around and hug people and strangers, high five people in the street for no reason. You don't get furious at some random event, some bad break, and you don't get to scream at the TV and use all the words that people told you not to use. You don't get to just do that in the middle of the office, right? Sports is an outlet for those feelings. Those are feelings that we all have about lots of different things, but we get to do them through this sort of proxy, which is our favorite team. And by doing that, we get to be members of a tribe. We get to have, friends who aren't really friends, they're random strangers. But if I'm walking down the street in New York City and I see a guy with a Georgia hat, I'm yelling, "Go Dogs," and that guy's probably yelling, "Go Dogs" back at me. We don't know each other. We'll never see each other again. But somehow we're still members of this tribe together. And I think finding this common thing that we can all be happy about or all find solace in or all find some joy in or whatever, those things matter, even if it's on the surface of it. If you just tried to explain sports to a Martian and said we bring 100,000 people to watch a game because they're guys dressed in our colors against guys that are dressed in the other team's colors. I don't know any of those guys. And those guys are going to be gone in a couple of years. There'll be different guys that I also don't know. They would look at you like you're an idiot, right? But when you think about it as sort of like a metaphor, when you think about what those teams mean to us and how we can divert that energy that is kind of built up inside us through these teams and how they can mean something to us. Well, then I think if you look at it that way, sports are really powerful. And I think for many of us, really necessary. It gives us an outlet that we get in no other place. And that's why it matters to me.
Tommy, this has been so life-giving just to have this conversation with you. This has brought me a lot of joy. Man, my noggin has just been processing and working and say so well, but man, just so many things you said. I'm this has been a very life-giving conversation. So I just really, really appreciate your time and your insight and all that you shared with us. It's been awesome.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Well, wish you could go on, but as Tommy said, all podcasts must end. So from the Rockies of Colorado to the Banks of Missouri, thanks to all our listeners from points in between and not in between. Until next time, he's John and I'm Adam. Stay classy, Frostburg.